What's up, my wizards? It's Deb from Mtg. We like magic, and the dust is settled from Pro Tour Dominaria. So it's time, I think, we had a little sit down, hang out with me right here on the couch, and I'll talk about the best decks in Standard right now. Here it is, the Standard tier list. Now, a quick note before we dive in here. If you want full deck lists for any of the things that we talk about today, it's your lucky day. Just check out the description down there. There's going to be a link to every single deck that we talk about today on TCG Player, who, by the way, sponsor my content because they're nice people. But anyway, now that's out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into Tier 3. Now, ultimately, deciding which decks to include in Tier 3 was way harder than determining the top tier decks. So there's a lot of decks down here at the bottom that deserve some kind of mention. You know, there's Mono-Black Control, Blue-Green Karn, even Green-Red Monsters is still sort of a deck. So there's a lot of stuff down here, but there are a couple of decks that I think deserve a special spotlight. So I'll start with the deck that is effectively number 10 on the list, Green-White Midrange. You know, in a way, this deck is the reason the format is the way it is. It was a force towards the beginning of Dominaria Standard, in part due to its ability to land a Lyra Dawnbringer at least a turn early, and sometimes even on turn 3, with the help of Llanowar Elves and Servant of the Conduit. But the black-red aggro decks partially rose up as a response to Lyra Dawnbringer because Unlicensed Disintegration is such a humiliating play against Lyra. So in some ways, we at least partially have Lyra to thank for the way this standard has evolved to this point. Now, even though this deck has lost some luster since the format began, it's always waiting in the background for the red-black aggro decks to either cut too many copies of Disintegration or get overtaken by the mono-red decks, at which point this deck will be in a good position again, and it's been attempting to evolve. For instance, another one of the cards in the deck, Shalai, used to be a one-of, but more recently you see 3 copies in the deck to protect against removal, along with the 4-of Blossoming Defense, which still feels like a blowout in this standard. The deck has lots of options for removal, like Cast Out and Seal Away, along with the occasional sideboard Settle the Wreckage. It also plays an assortment of vehicles, the most interesting of which is Sky Sovereign Console Flagship, which is great in a format where Goblin Chain Whirler is a problem card. And attacking through Glorybringers is a nice bonus too. To finish things up here, you'll usually see the full 4-of Walking Ballista, as well as some number of Thrashing Brontodons, usually to the author's taste. But it's a powerful card right now, given that there are tons of targets for it in lots of different matchups. But perhaps the most interesting card in the deck is the 2-of Ajani Unyielding that is universal among different builds. Sometimes this deck is more focused on History of Benalia, and it'll play Knight of Grace to go along with it, but even in those cases, this deck will fit a 2-of Ajani in there somewhere. His first ability is great card advantage, and his second ability is great removal. Plus he comes with a high loyalty, and we've got plenty of ways to protect him in this deck. So we haven't gotten to see Ajani very much in Standard, but this is the mid-range deck he'd been waiting for. Overall, the Lyra deck is a bit of a fallen angel, so to speak, but if you'll allow me another pun, this deck is always waiting in the wings, so it does need to be somewhat respected. Now, the other list that's still hanging on here in Tier 3 is one that's been kicking around in Standard for a really long time. It's definitely a known quantity, and it's come a long way since playing in the finals of Pro Tours, but it's definitely still here, and it's a deck that needs to be respected too. Number 9, basically, is Blue-White Godfarrow's Gift. Now, truth be told, there are still a smattering of different gift lists in the format, like recently Blue-Red Gift top 4 in SCG Classic, and there was even a Blue-Green Gift deck registered at the Pro Tour, but good old Blue-White is still the most consistent performer in the bunch. It just put 2 lists in the top 8 of an MTGO Pro Tour qualifier, and both it and its various brethren have been continuing to have an important place in the online meta overall. Now, the song remains the same for the most part. You use Champion of Wits, Minister of Inquiries, Chart a Course, and or Strategic Planning to drop that Godfarrow's Gift and a couple of nice creatures into your graveyard. And then you cast Refurbish on the Godfarrow's Gift and get a 6/6 flying life-linking Vigilancing Angel of Invention. And it's even got some new tricks from Dominaria, or should I say a new Trickster from Dominaria. Merfolk Trickster can do all kinds of fun stuff when you play it from your hand, but it's also nice they have the option to gift it into play, to tap down a creature, and swing with haste, by the way. The deck even picks up Teferi from Dominaria because, you know, why not? We're blue-white, so why not play the best card in the whole Azorius guild currently? Now, there's not too much to add here. I've more or less told you about the entire main deck, except for the occasional Sunscourge Champions and Fumigates, you know. Champion is insane against aggro and represents 2 bodies against control, and we play through our own Fumigate better than pretty much any other deck with creatures in Standard. But moving on up, let's take a look at tier 2.5. And the reason I'm doing tier 2.5 here is because I think there is separation between this tier, the last tier that we looked at, and the rest of the decks yet to come. But I don't think there's a full degree of separation in either case, whether you're going up the ladder or down the ladder. So with that said, let's go ahead and look at the first of the two decks in this tier, Blue-Black Midrange. Now, I should point out that there's a Sultai mid-range deck that's incredibly similar to this, and the only green card in that list is Vraska Relic Seeker, and in pretty much every other way, it's identical to the blue-black mid-range list, which are equally as popular. And these two colors are an interesting choice for a mid-range deck, but the pieces are definitely there. We get all the usual removal pieces a blue-black control deck would play, like Fatal Push, Cast Down, and Vraska's Contempt, but the real interesting action is in the creature base, where we get the Scarab God, which can reanimate creatures that, well, quote-unquote reanimate, creatures that you kill with Push or Cast Down, but it really shines with the deck's own creatures. Most of our creatures generate some form of value, like Glintsleeve Siphoner and Champion of Wits, both of which get much better when reanimated, and most of our creatures follow the same pattern as Godpharaoh's Gifts creature set, in that they're all Obi-Wans. You know, if you strike them down, they become more powerful. Ravenous Chupacabra and Gonti are both good examples of this, too. They provide awesome value when you cast them from your hand, but they become amazing when the bug puts 4/4 versions of them into play. And Gifted Aetherborn and Walking Ballista round out the cast of characters here, with Gifted being a brick wall against aggro in the early turns, and Walking Ballista sort of continuing its ongoing bromance with Beetlejuice. Now, the strength in this deck lies in its grindiness and its two-phase approach to the game. In the early turns, you'll deploy your threats and removal as any normal mid-range deck would, and in the process, you'll lose your creatures to combat interactions and removal of the opponents. But when you land the Scarab God, Phase 2 begins, wherein the blue-black pilot gains access to creatures from both graveyards. And this equates to, quote, drawing a fistful of cards, the turn that you untap with a Bugsy in play, and this can lead to some crazy and not so obvious play lines in the late game, like using a Ballista to shoot your own Chupacabra or Champion of Wits, and then, quote, reanimating them with the Scarab God. That's a common play line that's actually pretty busted, but you don't hear too many people talk about. Currently, there are two big factors against this deck, however, the first of which is the presence of Goblin Chainwhirler as a mainstay in the format. It kills both Glintsleeve Siphoner and Champion of Wits, and even though the deck can eventually Scarab God him out of the graveyard later in the game, the opposing aggro deck has to actually let you get to that point in the game. And secondly, the Scarab God has fallen out of favor recently, mostly because a lot of the key removal in standard exiles, which does lessen his effectiveness. And he has the same problem Lyra Dawnbringer has against Unlicensed Disintegration, namely that it turns your 5-mana play into a bolt to the face and a ton of lost tempo and mana value. You know, this deck actually has to get to Phase 2 to have any real chance of winning the game. And it's not always a given, but when it does, it grinds really hard. But moving on to the other deck in tier 2.5, this is an exciting one to cover because it's the mono green deck that's literally never mono green. Let's take a look at Steel Leaf Stompy. You know, again, this deck is tough to cover because it isn't just one deck. Sometimes this deck is green-blue, and then sometimes it's green-black, and sometimes the author gets really ambitious and goes like full-on Sultai, but either way, the deck has to be mostly green because it's looking to be the premier Steel Leaf champion deck, hence the name. Aside from the very obvious combination of Llanowar Elves plus SLC, the deck universally runs Heart of Kiran, Ronus the Indomitable, and some number of Ghalta Primal Hunger. And when you total all that up, it makes for a deck that consistently deploys a high number of big fat threats, which can be further pumped up by Resilient Kinra, and Verdurous Gearhulk, and Blossoming Defense, which doubles as the preferred way to counter removal in Standard for green decks. But, speaking of countering removal, that's exactly why the deck opts to play blue so often. The version of Steel Leaf Stomps that placed in the top 4 at Pro Tour Dominaria played blue for sideboard counterspells like Negate, as well as a single sideboard River's Rebuke, which pairs nicely with our elves. We can ramp it a little quicker, you know, and it means game over against other creature decks for the most part. And the deck can pull off the double blue because there are actually something like 14 blue sources between Botanical Sanctum, Hinterland Harbor, Ether Hub, and Servant of the Conduit, all of which can also make green, so they don't cramp your style at all. But on the other hand, adding black is also a popular option because you get Scrap Heap Scrounger, which is an awesome tool against the control decks, as well as Fatal Push for the aggro decks, and even sideboard like Vraska Relic Seekers for the mid-range matchups. But the cool thing is that green-black gets the same fast lands and check lands as green-blue, so there are no worries about the mana base there either. Now, time will tell what the better build is. Blue-green is better against Settle the Wreckage and Seal Away, and the sideboard negates can counter Teferis in a punch, so it looks to get the nod against control decks, but Scrap Heap's a hot card against control too, and having access to removal is always a good thing, but in the end I think this deck naturally goes over the top of most aggro decks anyway, but it does struggle with control, so blue-green may be the way to go forward. But now we've made our way into Tier 2 proper here, and this contains 2 decks too. And one of them is a Dominaria Original, the other one's a Kaladesh Classic. And although theoretically I don't think that there's too much separation between these 2 decks, I'll start with the newer one first, because newer decks tend to be far less tuned than older, more venerable decks. So let's go ahead and take a look at Black-White Aggro. Now, this list also takes a couple of different forms. The list that was gaining in popularity a couple of weeks back was essentially a vehicles list that emphasized Heart of Kiran and was a little lower to the ground, utilizing creatures like Toolcraft Exemplar. But the more recent lists, like the one that made the top 16 at the Pro Tour, pull back on Heart of Kiran by a couple of copies and cut Toolcraft altogether, in favor of a more mid-range strategy that plays up to 12 pieces of removal and focuses more on History of Benalia. To that end, the deck still runs Knight of Malice as a 4-of, and tries to run at least 1 to 3 Knight of Grace, which also just so happen to crew Heart of Kiran. The deck has also found its 5-drop Angel of Choice in Angel of Sanctions, which looks wonky compared to Lyra and Angel of Invention, but it's hot for 2 reasons. First, it's a great option against Seal Away and Settle the Wreckage because it doesn't have to attack. It can just deny them their best permanent, like just sit on it, and sometimes has to be dealt with twice before they're actually done with it. The other reason this particular Angel is so good for this deck is because the playline of Angel into Wipe Their Flyer into Crew Heart with Angel and Swing has the potential to be game-ending. Now, one thing that hasn't changed is the inclusion of the full playset of Karn here. Early on in the format, it was discovered that the combination of Heart of Kiran and Karn is actually a solid foundation to start a deck off with, and the cards work well together. Karn puts more gas in the tank, it crews Heart of Kiran, and it makes dudes that crew Heart of Kiran, and Karn can even just go wide if given enough time. But all in all, I think this is the perfect Orzhov deck right now. Seriously. There's a temptation to just play all the removal and Karn, but the deck benefits from playing some aggressive creatures in a format where a more removal-heavy deck would just be mostly blank against blue-white control. So finding just the right combination of threats and removal will be the key to this deck's evolution moving forward. But the better deck in Tier 2 and the effective halfway point of our list is one that's been in Standard for just about longer than any other deck on the entire list. Even though it's been around forever now, literally, it keeps churning out good performances, and it might be the most reliable list in Standard over the last 2 whole years. Of course, I'm talking about the Snake. Now, even though Constrictor has been slithering along for ages now, it has gotten a few new pieces from Dominaria. The addition of Llanowar Elves made the deck a step faster, and Adventurous Impulse has especially been a key inclusion for the deck as of late. It helps the deck find Snake on turn 1 if it didn't get it in its opening hand. And even Karn makes an appearance from time to time to just give the deck a way to keep its hand stocked up and to just create threats. But apart from that, the deck really isn't much different. It still stocks up on Glintsleeve Siphoners, Jadelight Rangers, and Verdurous Gearhulks, all of which are good creatures in their own right that are pushed into absurdity by Winding Constrictor. Now, on top of all that, Constrictor remains one of the best ways in Standard to abuse a Walking Ballista, which is another Standard all-star that's good in just about anything, but it's especially dirty in the Snake deck. And by the way, Karn isn't the only Planeswalker in this deck. Liliana, too, shows up as a way to grind out value out of the graveyard and repeat ETB triggers on Ravenous Chupacabra and Verdurous Gearhulk, or just to keep the Snake on the board. Now, this deck does have a couple of cool playlines that don't get enough buzz. Like, Llanowar Elves enables a few things, the most obvious of which is turn 2 Jadelight Ranger, and that's obviously busted, but there's also double Llanowar Elf starts that lead to turn 3 Verdurous Gearhulks, as well as turn 1 Elves into turn 2 Snake, and then on turn 3 you can get a 3/3 Walking Ballista. You actually have an unused green mana on turn 2 in that last playline, so theoretically you could use that to play another Elves or an Adventurous Impulse. And other cool sequences include Ravenous Chupacabra on turn 3 or 4 into a Gearhulk on the next turn, which instantly turns Chupacabra into a huge threat. Or you could top deck a Gearhulk and reanimate the Constrictor in your graveyard with Liliana to maximize the impact of that top deck. Now overall, Constrictor still makes a case for being the best pure mid-range deck in Standard right now. It can make a decent game out of just about any starting 7 cards, and all of its good cards are good without its namesake card needing to be in play. That's a secret to this deck. It still has a chance if it can't guarantee a Snake on turn 2. And in terms of curving out, this deck does it just as good or better than any other deck in the format right now. It's got explosive starts and just enough grindy elements to keep the engine running throughout the late game, but if it has any problems, it's that Glintleaf Siphoner and Llanowar Elves are weak to Goblin Chain Whirler, Snake is weak to Abrade, Lightning Strike, and Fatal Push. But that said, we force those decks to have specifically those answers in the early game, or they risk falling way behind against us, because once the pieces fall into place, we can close a game really quickly. But start getting excited because we're moving into the ones here. We've hit tier 1.5. Now, this tier actually contains two really similar decks that I'm actually going to cover concurrently. One is a deck that we've known about since the beginning of Standard, but hasn't really let up too much in its dominance, and that's Blue-White Control. Definitely one of the better decks in Standard, but another is a relatively new list that actually ended up being the only control deck in the top 8 of Pro Tour Dominaria, so I definitely should give it a mention here, and that's ESPER Control. So let's take a look at both of them. Now, first of all, these decks tended to take a couple of different forms at the beginning of the format. The one that was more popular towards the beginning of Dominaria Standard, and still pops up from time to time, uses Ravka Passion to deploy Teferi and a handful of other historic threats at instant speed. But as the season moved on, we began to see more and more pure control decks that played literally no creatures, eventually getting to the point where Teferi using his -3 ability on himself to keep you from decking yourself was the only actual win condition in the main deck. Now, the spell base in these decks tends to be extremely varied, but the same cards are used. It's just that the numbers are always different. Like, common counterspells include Disallow, which is almost always a 4 of, to be honest. Syncopate, which counters pretty much anything starting on turn 2, is an especially great on the play. And Essence Scatter, which is overpowered at the moment against any deck with mountains or forests, and pairs well with Teferi's first ability. Negate, too, goes well with Teferi's first ability, and is especially a nasty card in the mirror. Now, removal in white is a who's who of busted garbage, including some of the format's most feared pieces like Seal Away, Settle the Wreckage, and Fumigate, all of which are spectacular against the red aggro decks. And we get some unsung heroes in the form of Cast Out and the really impressive Blink of an Eye, which both give us a way to get non-creature permanents off the board in critical moments while occasionally providing cards in one form or another. Now, the Esper version of this deck is important because I think it might represent the way going forward for control decks in Standard. Now, this deck is actually more of a blue-black control deck that splashes white, rather than the black splash you might have been expecting. In fact, the only white card this deck plays in the main deck is Teferi, and it badly wants Settle the Wreckage or Fumigate, but it's greedy to ask for double blue for Disallow, double black for Vraska's Contempt, and double white for a sweeper. It could solve this with any number of black sweepers, but none of them seem quite good enough. Esper still needs to hammer out some problems with the mana base and how to best utilize its slots, but it does get access to Fatal Push, Cast Down, and Vraska's Contempt, all of which are much better spot removal against the red aggro decks than white currently has. And adding black also gives us access to the Scarab God, which is sweet in combination with Push and Cast Down, and gives Torrential Gearhulk an extra layer of playability. Fatcaster and Beetlejuice, to me, seem like a much more solid plan on paper for winning a game than the somewhat trollish plan of repeating Teferi to deck the opponent. If Esper can find a way to incorporate a white board wipe with all the black spot removal reliably, it has the potential to be the best deck in the format, hands down, but getting the mana right is going to be as difficult as it is important. We've finally reached the tip top of Tier 1, the S tier, superior tier, where there are two aggro decks, effectively, both of which play lots and lots of mountains. These two decks combine for a little over 30% of the meta share, which is just obscene. So let's go ahead and take a look at these two decks, which are effectively the best decks in the format right now. Now, most folks attribute the bulk of these decks' success to a single shared card, Goblin Chain Whirler. It's all the rage right now, all the cool kids are talking about it, and it is many things rolled into one. It's control against Llanowar Elves, Glintleaf Siphoner, Bomat Courier, and it's an incredibly solid body in combat, where the first strike is insanely relevant. It also forms a brutal combo with Soulscar Mage, which nerfs the opponent's team permanently. Other cards that are stock inclusions in both decks include Bomat Courier, Kari Zev, Rekindling Phoenix, and Abrade. Now, Bomat is an OG all-star that helps refill our hand, and in the red-black deck it unlocks Unlicensed Disintegration and Spire of Industry. Kari Zev is an aggressive creature against control that also plays defense early when you need it to against other aggro decks. where Kindling Phoenix is an obviously obnoxious fat flyer that's statistically more difficult to remove than a lot of other creatures in Standard. And Abrade is a must for killing small creatures in the mirror and busting up Heart of Kiran and a whole list of other artifacts. Abrade is actually one of the most format warping cards in Standard because A, every deck with mountains plays Abrade, and B, decks with mountains continue to be the most popular decks in the meta. And as long as both of these factors are true, there is little chance of any deck that goes all in on one artifact truly thriving in Standard. In terms of specific card choices that are unique to each list, the mono red deck is actually fairly familiar and is the decidedly faster strat by a lot. Earthshaker Kinra and Omcrap Crasher keep the pedal all the way to the floor early, and Hazoret comes down to finish the game out late. It's a tried and true game plan, and it's often fast enough to get underneath control decks. But the red-black decks are actually pretty different despite some shared card choices. While the pure red decks are focused more on speed, the red-black decks are more mid-range in their philosophies. They cut Earthshaker Kinras for Scrap Heap Scrounger, which enables both Heart of Kiran and Unlicensed Disintegration, two of the deck's other superstar cards. Scrounger is a great option against the control decks, as is Heart of Kiran because it dodges Seal Away, and it's generally a superior threat against almost any board on turn 3 or 4. And Unlicensed can be game-winning in a number of different ways. Sometimes it kills your 4 or 5 drop on curve and enables Alpha Strike, and sometimes they top deck it for that last few little bits of damage to put the game away. Disintegration, as discussed earlier, acts as a control for big threats like Lyra or any other high CMC creatures that don't generate any value outside of having a big body and a bunch of keywords. Now, other cards that push red-black into the mid-range category include Pia Nalar and the main deck Chandras and Glorybringers. Pia isn't as aggressive as Omcrap Crasher by a mile, but it still crews Heart of Kiran and it acts as a great mana sink while giving you a go-wide option that's good for both pressuring control and for blocking against aggro. Chandra can also crew the Heart of Kiran, and note, by the way, how awesome it is, that at least on a flavor level, that the entire Nalar family shows up in this deck. But she's also great card advantage, she's removal, and she's a game-winning ultimate when you can get to it. And Glorybringer is often just a 1 or 2 of in the main deck, but it's still effective against a lot of decks just to have a juicy flyer with haste that can double as removal, Bringer is one of the best top decks in the list, but when played on curve, it can still clear a path and just sew up the game out of nowhere. It's really difficult to tell which deck is the better choice at this point. Mono Red now has a Pro Tour win under its belt, but Black Red has been the more consistent performer by far over the last month, and it has a much larger share of the meta in all. The mono red deck is faster, and for what it's worth, the more budget deck, but the black-red list feels more tuned towards versatility, and buying the list doesn't actually cost that much either, compared to most of the other decks in the format. Now, to conclude here, just my final thoughts on Dominaria Standard. I don't think that the format is a closed matter, at least as of yet. The control decks adapt week by week, and if anything's going to overtake the red decks, it's probably going to be the control decks, at least while Dominaria Standard is still the standard format that we're in. And I think that the control decks do have the answers to be able to put together the right list to deal with these red decks without necessarily sacrificing too much against the decks that occupy the middle tiers. Now, looking towards the future just a little bit and doing a little bit of speculation, but it's fun. We might as well do it while we're here. I think that the decks under Tier 1 could greatly benefit from some pieces in core set to help combat these red decks, but I'm not holding my breath for spot removal on the level of Fatal Push or Sweeper on the level of Damnation or anything like that. But if there are just some workable dual lands that are good in core set, then I think that might really help out control decks. Change the game for them, smoothing out the mana is going to mean a lot for those decks. And it might even make 3-color mid-range decks that are full of answers mostly viable options against, because their mana will run a lot more smoothly if they get the right duels. And of course, looking even farther into the future, once rotation does hit in the fall, these mono red decks and these red black decks too just take a huge hit. They both lose 20 plus cards. Yeah, they get to keep Goblin Chainwhirler, but they lose just about every other really important piece they've been playing for the last couple of years, literally. So it's going to be a really tough row to hoe for them to get back on their feet after rotation hits. But even if mono red is still a viable option after rotation, it's probably going to look completely different than it looks now. Fingers crossed for goblins. We can only hope, right? But again, if mono red is a viable option, because Chainwhirler is going to be a card for a while now here, it's at least going to look completely different than it does now 4 months from now. And that pretty much wraps it up. I think I'm tapped out for now. Long video, I bet, but thanks for sticking with me through this whole thing, you guys. And if you want more content like this, make sure you sub if you haven't done it yet. Hit the bell for the notifications because there's way more content. There's deck techs, core set spoilers coming out really, really soon. And I've got a few backlog that I need to cover coming up later this week. So make sure you get with the channel and check the channel to see what all we've done that you haven't seen yet. There's been a lot of cool stuff lately. Infinite Power Stone Assembler combo for 25 bucks. That was a good deck. Should probably check that one out. But in any case, I hope you at least liked this video. If you enjoyed this video or found it informative or whatever. So do all that YouTube stuff. Follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev. And I'm pretty sure that's it, unless you want to kick $1 into the Patreon pot. It helps an awful lot. And if you do, I'll let you know what decks and videos we're doing the day before we do them. And you can help me vote on what decks we want to do next. So it's actually some pretty decent value for $1. Throw $1 in the Patreon pot if you can. I'll leave a link down there in the description with all the other decks and stuff. But I think that's actually it this time. I guess I'll catch you cats later. Any disagreements, get at me in the comments section. Let me know how you feel. But in any case, I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.